Get on your knees and wipe my shoes if you want your tip." The words cracked through the velvet glow of the restaurant like lightning splitting a church window. Forks froze halfway to expensive mouths. A jazz piano stumbled mid-note. Even the waiters near the champagne tower stopped breathing for half a second. Naomi Carter stood perfectly still beside table 12, one hand gripping a silver tray, the other trembling near the stained white napkin hanging from her wrist. Red wine dripped slowly from the edge of her black sleeve onto the polished marble floor of Maison Aurelia, one of downtown Chicago's most exclusive restaurants, where the rich came not just to eat, but to remind each other who mattered. And tonight, every wealthy guest in that room was watching a beautiful black waitress be humiliated like entertainment. Victoria Hale leaned back in her chair with the confidence of a woman who had never once been told no in her life. Diamonds wrapped around her fingers like tiny frozen crowns. Her champagne-colored dress shimmered beneath the chandelier light, while her sharp smile cut deeper than the insult itself. "What's wrong?" she asked loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Too proud to do your job?" A few nervous chuckles scattered across the dining room. Not real laughter. The kind people use when they're afraid to disagree with money. Naomi lowered her eyes for exactly 1 second, just long enough to steady her breathing. She had learned years ago that survival sometimes sounded like silence. Around her, crystal glasses glowed beneath amber lighting. The scent of truffle butter and bourbon floated through the air while a soft trumpet played somewhere near the back lounge. Everything about the room screamed elegance. Everything except the moment unfolding at table 12. "Victoria, maybe let it go," one man at the table muttered awkwardly. But Victoria waved him off without looking away from Naomi. "No," she said coldly. "People like her need to learn respect. People like her." 3 words. Heavy with history. Heavy with poison. Naomi felt them land harder than the spilled wine soaking into her cuff. But she didn't cry. Didn't argue. Didn't defend herself. She simply stood there with quiet dignity, the kind that made cruel people even angrier because they couldn't break it. Near the back corner of the restaurant, hidden beneath the shadows of a private VIP booth, a man slowly set down his whiskey glass. Ethan Sterling had been silent the entire evening. 6'3", tailored charcoal suit, silver watch reflecting the dim candlelight. The billionaire CEO of Sterling Capital was known across America for buying dying companies and rebuilding them into empires. On Wall Street, they called him the Ghost because he rarely spoke and almost never lost. Tonight, he had come to Maison Aurelia for a private acquisition meeting involving the restaurant's parent company. But now, his attention had shifted completely. His blue eyes rested on Naomi Carter. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Not because she looked afraid, though her hands trembled slightly. He watched her because even while being humiliated in front of a room full of millionaires, she still carried herself like someone the world had failed to defeat. Victoria suddenly grabbed a folded $20 bill from her purse and dropped it onto the marble floor near Naomi's feet. "Go ahead," she smirked. "Earn it." The room went dead silent. Somewhere in the back, the piano stopped completely. Naomi stared at the bill on the floor. Her chest tightened. Not from the money, from the memory. 6 years of double shifts. 6 years of fake smiles. 6 years of people looking through her instead of at her. She thought about her little brother waiting at home in their tiny South Side apartment. Thought about the overdue hospital bill sitting on her kitchen counter. Thought about every moment she swallowed her pride just to survive another day. Then slowly, Naomi bent down toward the floor. And from the shadows of the VIP section, Ethan Sterling finally stood up. Naomi's fingers stopped less than an inch from the $20 bill. The restaurant held its breath. Candlelight flickered across polished wine glasses while the silence stretched so tight it felt dangerous. Then a slow, steady sound cut through the room. Footsteps. Expensive leather against marble. Ethan Sterling moved across Maison Aurelia with the calm certainty of a man who had never needed permission to enter any space on earth. Heads turned immediately. Conversations died at nearby tables. Even the bartenders straightened their posture when they recognized him. Victoria Hale noticed the shift in the room and smiled automatically, assuming the billionaire was approaching her table for the same reason most powerful men did. Attention, approval, access. But Ethan did not look at her. Not once. His eyes remained fixed on Naomi as she slowly rose back to her feet, leaving the money untouched on the floor between them like an insult nobody wanted to claim. Up close, Ethan could see the faint exhaustion behind her eyes. The kind exhaustion no amount of sleep fixes. It was the exhaustion of survival. "Pick it up," Victoria said sharply, her voice breaking the silence again. "Or are you too proud for $20? Naomi swallowed carefully. Her throat felt tight. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I was trying to apologize for the spill." Victoria laughed under her breath. "No, you were trying to embarrass me." Ethan finally turned toward Victoria. The temperature in the room seemed to drop with the movement alone. He did not raise his voice. Men like Ethan Sterling never needed to. "She already apologized," he said evenly. Victoria blinked in surprise before forcing a polished smile. "Mr. Sterling, I did not realize you were here tonight." Ethan ignored the greeting completely. "You dropped something," he said calmly, glancing at the bill on the floor. A nervous ripple moved through nearby tables. Victoria shifted in her chair. "It is just a tip." "No," Ethan replied. "It is humiliation disguised as generosity." The words landed like stones in water. Heavy, sharp, impossible to ignore. Naomi stared at him silently, unsure what was happening. In 6 years working restaurants, nobody had ever stepped in for her. Not managers, not customers, not coworkers afraid of losing shifts. People usually looked away when dignity became inconvenient. But Ethan Sterling was still standing there, still looking directly at her like she mattered. Victoria crossed her arms. Defensively, "She works for tips. I was helping." Ethan glanced around the restaurant slowly, his expression unreadable. "Interesting," he said quietly, "because from where I am standing, it looks more like you were trying to remind everyone who you think deserves respect." The room froze again. A server near the kitchen nearly dropped a tray of champagne flutes. At the hostess stand, 2 employees exchanged stunned looks. Nobody spoke to Victoria Hale that way. She was rich, connected, constantly photographed at charity galas and fashion events across Chicago. But Ethan Sterling was something else entirely. Older money, bigger power, the kind that did not need social media to prove it existed. Victoria laughed awkwardly. "You are making this dramatic." Ethan slid one hand into his pocket. "No," he said softly. "You already did that the second you asked another human being to kneel for your entertainment." Naomi felt heat rush behind her eyes, but she forced herself to stay composed. Her mother used to tell her something when she was little. Never let cruelty decide your posture. So Naomi stood straight beneath the chandelier light, even while every heartbeat trembled inside her chest. Ethan noticed, and somehow, that quiet strength irritated him more than if she had cried, because he recognized it. He had seen that same look once before in another woman standing silently inside another room, full of wealthy people pretending not to notice humiliation. His mother. Ethan slowly bent down, picked up the $20 bill from the marble floor, and placed it gently on the table beside Victoria's untouched champagne glass. Then he looked directly at Naomi and asked one simple question that changed the entire energy of the room. "What is your name?" The question lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Not because it was complicated, because nobody important had ever bothered to ask her before. Naomi felt dozens of wealthy eyes pressing against her skin, while soft jazz music slowly returned somewhere near the bar, uncertain and fragile, like the room itself did not know how to recover. She tightened her grip on the silver tray and answered carefully. "Naomi Carter, sir." Ethan nodded once, almost thoughtfully, as if committing the name to memory. "How long have you worked here, Naomi?" "Almost 6 years." A faint reaction moved across his face. 6 years. Long enough to become invisible. Long enough to master the art of smiling while people reduced you to background decoration. Victoria let out a sharp breath of irritation. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You are turning a spilled drink into some kind of social justice performance." Ethan turned toward her slowly. "No," he said calmly. "I think you already did that when you asked another adult human being to kneel in front of strangers." A few people nearby lowered their eyes immediately. Nobody wanted to become part of the conversation now. The power in the room had shifted too suddenly. Victoria crossed her legs and forced a laugh that sounded thinner than before. "You do not know who I am." Ethan's expression never changed. "That is not the problem." The sentence hit hard enough to silence even the nearby tables pretending not to listen. Naomi stood frozen beside them, unsure whether she should stay or disappear into the kitchen before management blamed her for everything. She already knew how places like Maison Aurelia worked. The customer with money survived the night. The waitress became the inconvenience. At the hostess stand, restaurant manager Daniel Reeves finally stepped forward, his face pale beneath the golden chandelier lights. "Mr. Sterling," he said nervously, "I am sure we can resolve this privately." Ethan glanced toward him. "Can we?" Daniel swallowed quickly. "Of course." Ethan looked around the restaurant. Crystal glasses, velvet booths, guests dressed in luxury worth more than most people's rent. Then his eyes landed on Naomi again, still standing in her stained uniform, while everyone discussed her like a public relations problem instead of a person. Something cold settled behind his expression. "Interesting business model," he said quietly. "You build an entire restaurant around hospitality, then punish the only person in this room actually showing dignity." Nobody answered. Daniel attempted an awkward smile. "Sir, emotions are high." Ethan stepped closer to Naomi. Not too close. Just enough for the room to understand where his attention was now. "Did anyone ask if you were okay?" he asked her softly. Naomi hesitated. The question alone nearly broke something inside her. Because no, nobody had. Not after the insult. Not after the humiliation. Not after standing there while strangers watched her like a scene from a reality show. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I am fine." Ethan studied her for a second longer. People who survive hardship often say those exact words, even when they are drowning. He knew that too well. When Ethan was 14 years old, he once watched his mother get publicly embarrassed at a luxury fundraiser because she had arrived wearing a department store dress among women covered in designer labels. He still remembered the smile she forced all night, pretending not to notice the whispers. That memory had followed him longer than success ever did. Victoria suddenly pushed back her chair with visible frustration. "This waitress spilled wine on me," she said sharply. "And now somehow I am the villain?" Ethan looked directly at her. "No," he replied evenly. "Your behavior handled that part on its own." A stunned silence crashed over the room again. One woman near the bar quietly lowered her phone after secretly recording the exchange. Daniel looked like he might faint. But Ethan Sterling was no longer interested in saving the atmosphere. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. "Marcus," he said calmly the second the line connected. "I need every ownership document tied to Maison Aurelia on my desk tonight, including the parent company." Naomi blinked in confusion. Daniel's face lost all color. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Hale stopped smiling completely. The air inside Maison Aurelia no longer felt luxurious. It felt unstable, like one wrong sentence could crack the entire room apart. Victoria Hale stared across the table at Ethan Sterling, trying to recover the confidence that usually came so naturally to her. But something about him unsettled people when he became quiet. It was the kind of silence that carried consequences. Daniel Reeves rushed forward with the nervous energy of a man trying to stop a disaster before it reached the newspapers. "Mr. Sterling," he said carefully, lowering his voice, "there is no need to involve corporate ownership over a misunderstanding." Ethan slipped his phone back into his jacket. "You are right," he answered calmly. "There is no misunderstanding at all." Naomi remained motionless beside the table, unsure whether she should leave or stay. Every instinct told her to disappear before this situation turned uglier. She could already imagine tomorrow's outcome. Staff meeting, forced apology, lost shifts, maybe termination. Workers like her were always replaceable in places like this. But Ethan's attention shifted toward her again before she could move. "Naomi," he said softly, "did management ask you to kneel tonight?" Daniel immediately stepped in. "Sir, of course not." Ethan never looked away from Naomi. "I did not ask him." The room became painfully still again. Naomi hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward Daniel for half a second. Fear, habit, survival. Then quietly, she answered. Not directly. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. But they would have allowed it. Naomi said nothing this time. She did not need to. The silence answered for her. Victoria scoffed loudly. "This is absurd. She is a waitress, not some oppressed princess." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Ethan turned slowly toward Victoria, and for the first time all evening, something sharper appeared beneath his calm expression. "Funny thing about dignity," he said evenly. The people who deserve it most are usually the ones society trains itself to ignore. Across the dining room, guests who had once enjoyed the spectacle now looked deeply uncomfortable. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others pretended to study menus they had already ordered from an hour ago. Because deep down, many of them recognized something ugly in the room tonight. Not just Victoria's cruelty. Their silence. Ethan glanced around the restaurant one more time before speaking again. Do you know what the real problem is here? Nobody answered. Everybody watched this woman get humiliated. He continued calmly. And the only thing most of you were worried about was whether it would ruin dinner. The words landed hard. A man near the bar quietly set down his bourbon glass. A woman at table 9 slowly lowered her eyes in shame. Naomi felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. Not because of the attention, because somebody had finally said out loud what she had felt for years. Ethan looked back at her. What were you doing before this happened? Naomi blinked slightly, caught off guard by the question. Serving table 7. No, Ethan said quietly. Before this job. Her throat tightened again. Nobody ever asked about before. To most customers, waitresses simply appeared in uniforms one day without history or dreams attached to them. Naomi looked down briefly before answering. I studied piano. The room seemed to soften for a second. Ethan noticed the way her voice changed when she said it. Softer. Almost protective. Where? Juilliard. Several heads turned instantly. Even Victoria looked surprised. Ethan studied her carefully now. You went to Juilliard? Naomi nodded once. For 2 years. What happened? Naomi forced a small smile that carried more exhaustion than joy. Life happened. Ethan understood immediately. Hospital bills. Family responsibility. Rent. Sacrifice. America was full of gifted people whose dreams got buried beneath survival. And somehow, that realization angered him more than the insult itself. A pianist from Juilliard standing in a stained waitress uniform while wealthy strangers threw money at her feet. Something about it felt deeply wrong. Ethan slowly loosened the cuff of his suit jacket and glanced toward the grand piano sitting untouched near the lounge stage at the far end of the restaurant. Then he looked back at Naomi. Can you still play? Naomi stared at him silently while the entire room waited for her answer. Naomi looked toward the grand piano at the far end of the restaurant as if it belonged to another lifetime. The polished black surface reflected the chandelier light in soft golden waves while conversations around the dining room faded into uneasy silence. For a moment, she forgot about the wine on her sleeve, forgot about Victoria, forgot about the dozens of wealthy strangers staring at her like she had suddenly become the center of a story nobody expected. All she saw was the piano. Her piano professor at Juilliard used to say something she never forgot. A real musician does not stop loving music. They only learn how to survive without touching it. Naomi swallowed carefully. Not anymore, she answered quietly. Ethan studied her face. That is not what I asked. The room tightened again. Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically and grabbed her champagne glass. Are we seriously turning dinner into some inspirational movie now? Nobody laughed this time. Ethan ignored her completely. His attention remained on Naomi. Can you still play? He repeated gently. Naomi looked away toward the piano once more. The truth sat heavy in her chest. She had not touched one in almost 3 years. Not since hospital bills swallowed her savings after her younger brother Marcus lost the ability to walk following a drunk driving accident on the south side. After that came overtime shifts, double shifts, sleepless mornings. Survival replaced music one bill at a time. A little, she admitted softly. Ethan nodded once toward the stage. Then play. Naomi blinked in surprise. Sir, I cannot. Why? Daniel immediately stepped forward again. Mr. Sterling, our live pianist already left for the evening. Ethan reached into his pocket and placed a folded $100 bill onto the nearest table without even looking at it. Then consider his replacement covered. A nervous laugh escaped someone near the bar. Naomi stood frozen. Her heart pounded painfully beneath her uniform. I am working, she whispered. Ethan glanced toward Daniel. Is she? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Nobody in the room wanted to oppose Ethan Sterling now. Not after hearing he was requesting ownership documents. Not after watching him dismantle Victoria Hale without ever raising his voice. Ethan stepped slightly closer to Naomi, lowering his tone enough that only nearby tables could hear. You spent years serving people who never looked at you, he said quietly. Tonight, they can listen. Something inside Naomi almost broke at those words. Because deep down, she remembered who she used to be before life became survival. Before exhaustion replaced ambition. Before she learned that talent does not always matter when rent is due every month. The room waited silently as Naomi slowly removed the black serving tray from her hands and placed it onto the hostess stand beside her. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear of failure, from fear of remembering who she had once dreamed of becoming. Victoria scoffed loudly again. This is unbelievable. Ethan finally looked toward her. No, he said calmly. What is unbelievable is how quickly people mistake wealth for worth. Victoria's expression hardened instantly. Across the restaurant, several guests quietly turned their chairs toward the piano stage now, curiosity overtaking discomfort. Phones slowly appeared beneath tables. A bartender dimmed the lights near the lounge almost instinctively. Naomi took a slow breath and began walking across the marble floor toward the piano. Her black uniform still carried the stain from Victoria's spilled wine, but somehow she no longer looked small. The farther she walked, the straighter her posture became. Like every step pulled another buried piece of herself back to the surface. Ethan watched silently from behind, while candlelight flickered against the dark piano waiting beneath the spotlight. Naomi reached the bench and stopped. For one terrifying second, she considered turning around and disappearing into the kitchen forever. Because it was safer to remain invisible, safer to be underestimated. Then she heard her mother's voice in the back of her mind from years ago. Baby, the world will try to convince you that survival is enough. Do not let it make you forget you were born for more. Naomi slowly sat down at the piano while the entire restaurant held its breath. Naomi rested her shaking hands above the piano keys without touching them. The restaurant stood completely still around her. No silverware clinking. No whispered business deals. No forced laughter from wealthy strangers pretending to enjoy overpriced wine. Just silence. The kind of silence that arrives right before something changes. Candlelight reflected softly across the polished black piano, while dozens of eyes remained fixed on the young black waitress sitting beneath the spotlight in her stained uniform. Somewhere near the back wall, a glass of ice slowly cracked from the warmth in the room. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second and inhaled carefully. She could still remember the smell of Juilliard practice rooms at 2 in the morning. Coffee, dust, old sheet music, the ache in her fingertips after 6 straight hours of rehearsal. Back then, she believed talent alone could save her life. But life had introduced her to bills, grief, responsibility, and survival. Dreams became expensive once reality arrived. Slowly, Naomi lowered her fingers onto the keys. The first note floated through Maison Aurelia so softly, it almost sounded fragile. Then another followed. Then another. Within seconds, the room transformed. The piano no longer sounded like background music for rich people eating steak beneath chandeliers. It sounded alive, honest, human. Conversations stopped completely. Even the kitchen staff quietly leaned through the service doors to listen. Naomi played with the kind of emotion that cannot be taught in music schools because pain had shaped every note differently. There was exhaustion in the melody, loneliness, grace, hope buried beneath years of disappointment. Ethan Sterling stood motionless near the center of the dining room, watching her carefully. And for the first time all night, something in his expression softened. Because he understood immediately what everyone else in the room was finally realizing. Naomi Carter had never belonged carrying trays between tables. She belonged here, beneath light, beneath music. Somewhere near the bar, one woman quietly wiped tears from her face before pretending to fix her makeup. A couple celebrating their anniversary stopped eating entirely. Even Daniel Reeves stood frozen beside the hostess stand, staring at Naomi like he was seeing her for the first time in 6 years. Victoria Hale shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The room that once laughed beside her now ignored her completely. Attention had moved on. Power had moved on. And she hated it. Naomi's hands moved faster across the keys now, confidence slowly returning with every measure. The music rose through the restaurant like something waking up after years asleep. Her posture straightened. Her shoulders relaxed. Piece by piece, the frightened waitress disappeared, and the artist underneath finally returned. Ethan glanced around the room quietly. Phones were everywhere now. Guests recording, whispering, posting clips online before the performance had even finished. One caption already floated across social media somewhere in Chicago. The waitress at Maison Aurelia just shocked the entire restaurant. But Ethan was not watching the phones. He was watching Naomi, because he recognized something most people missed. This was not about talent alone. It was about dignity. About what happens when someone who has spent years invisible finally gets seen. Naomi reached the final movement of the piece, and the entire restaurant seemed to lean forward unconsciously. The music swelled beneath the chandeliers with breathtaking emotion before ending on one final trembling note that lingered in the air long after her fingers left the keys. Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Reverent silence. Then suddenly, one person began clapping. Ethan Sterling. Slow. Steady. Unapologetic. The sound echoed through the stunned restaurant. Another guest joined him. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause so loud it drowned out the jazz speakers overhead. Naomi looked down immediately, overwhelmed, her chest rising sharply as emotion threatened to break through years of carefully controlled composure. She had spent so long surviving that she forgot what recognition felt like. Ethan walked slowly toward the piano while the applause continued around them like thunder. Then, in front of the entire restaurant, he removed his tailored suit jacket and gently draped it over Naomi's wine-stained shoulders. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried through the room with quiet certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "the Queen has returned." The applause refused to die. It rolled through Maison Aurelia in waves, echoing beneath crystal chandeliers and gold-trimmed ceilings like the entire building itself had finally awakened. Naomi sat frozen at the piano bench with Ethan Sterling's suit jacket resting across her shoulders, still trying to understand how a night that began with humiliation had transformed into something unreal. Her hands trembled softly in her lap, while strangers who would not have looked at her an hour earlier now stared at her with admiration. Respect. Some even stood from their tables. Victoria Hale remained seated, her face tight with disbelief as the room she once controlled slipped completely out of her grasp. She glanced around desperately, searching for support, but nobody was paying attention to her anymore. The spotlight had moved. And for people addicted to attention, invisibility feels like punishment. Ethan stood beside the piano calmly while guests continued recording videos across the restaurant. Somewhere online, clips of Naomi's performance were already spreading through Chicago's social media pages faster than anyone inside Maison Aurelia realized. One post read, "A waitress just turned an entire luxury restaurant silent." Another simply said, "The way that Billionaire looked at her after she played." But Ethan ignored all of it. He looked down at Naomi instead. "How long has it been since someone applauded for you?" he asked quietly. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. "A long time." Ethan nodded once like he already knew the answer. Because society often celebrates wealthy people for existing while forcing talented people to beg for visibility. And tonight, that truth sat exposed beneath expensive lighting and designer clothing. Daniel Reeves hurried toward the piano with a nervous smile stretched across his face. "Naomi," he said quickly, "that was incredible. Truly incredible." Naomi looked at him silently. The same manager who barely remembered her birthday after 6 years suddenly sounded proud to know her. Ethan noticed too. "Funny how talent becomes visible once rich people approve of it," he said evenly. Daniel's smile weakened immediately. A few nearby guests looked down. Awkwardly, Ethan turned toward Naomi again. "Did they ever let you play here before tonight?" Naomi gave a small shake of her head. "No, why not?" Daniel stepped in too fast. "Mr. Sterling, our entertainment scheduling is very selective." Ethan glanced toward the empty piano bench beside Naomi. Clearly, the room shifted uneasily again. Victoria suddenly stood from her chair, grabbing her designer purse sharply. "This entire night is ridiculous," she snapped. "Everybody is acting like she cured cancer because she played a piano." The bitterness in her voice sliced through the applause still lingering around the room. Naomi's shoulders tightened instinctively. Old survival instincts returning. But Ethan remained calm. "No," he replied softly. "People are reacting because they finally witnessed someone treated like a human being instead of decoration." Victoria laughed bitterly. "She is a waitress." Ethan looked directly at her. And you still have not figured out that says more about your character than hers. The silence afterward felt massive. One couple near the front windows quietly nodded to themselves. A bartender tried unsuccessfully to hide his grin. Victoria's face flushed with humiliation before she turned sharply toward Daniel. I spend $50,000 a year in this restaurant. Daniel immediately panicked. Ms. Hale, please. But Ethan interrupted smoothly. Not anymore. Every head turned toward him again. Ethan pulled out his phone calmly as another call came through. He answered without taking his eyes off Victoria. Talk to me. A voice spoke through the speaker quietly enough that only Ethan could hear clearly. He listened for several seconds, then nodded once. Good. Begin the transfer tonight. Daniel's face drained white all over again. Transfer. Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket. The parent company accepted my offer 20 minutes ago. The room froze. Naomi blinked in confusion. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. Ethan looked around Maison Aurelia slowly, from the marble floors to the velvet booths to the piano still vibrating faintly from Naomi's final note. Then he spoke with the calm certainty of a man changing the course of an entire room. As of tonight, he said evenly, this restaurant belongs to me. The silence after Ethan Sterling's announcement felt almost sacred. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a drink. The entire restaurant stood suspended inside one impossible moment while the weight of his words settled over marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Maison Aurelia belonged to him now. Not tomorrow. Not after paperwork cleared. Tonight. Victoria Hale stared at Ethan as though the room itself had betrayed her. You cannot be serious, she whispered. Ethan looked at her calmly. I rarely spend $80 million joking. A quiet gasp moved through nearby tables. $80 million. Some guests exchanged stunned looks while others immediately checked their phones, already searching financial headlines for confirmation. Daniel Reeves looked like a man watching his career collapse in real time. Sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the cool air flowing through the restaurant. Naomi remained seated at the piano bench, Ethan's jacket still draped across her shoulders, trying to process everything happening around her. Just 1 hour earlier, she had been preparing herself to apologize for existing. Now the most powerful man in the room had purchased the entire building after watching her get humiliated. It did not feel real. Victoria suddenly laughed sharply, but there was panic underneath it now. This is insane. You are destroying a luxury brand over one emotional moment. Ethan turned toward her slowly. No, he said evenly. I am exposing what kind of place this already was. The words landed hard enough to make several employees lower their eyes. Because deep down, they knew he was right. Maison Aurelia had always protected wealthy customers faster than hardworking staff. Dignity depended on income here. Tonight simply forced everyone to see it clearly. Ethan walked toward the center of the dining room, while every guest followed him with their eyes. Listen carefully, he said calmly. The problem with places like this is not the architecture, not the menu, not the money. He paused briefly. It is the belief that people serving the room matter less than the people sitting inside it. Nobody interrupted him. Even Victoria stayed silent now. Ethan glanced toward Naomi again. That woman spent 6 years carrying trays for strangers while hiding more talent, discipline, and grace than most people in this building will ever possess. Naomi looked down immediately, overwhelmed by the attention again. Years of invisibility do not disappear overnight. Ethan continued calmly. And somehow all it took for this room to finally notice her was public humiliation. One older man near the back slowly removed his glasses, visibly ashamed. A woman beside him whispered quietly, "He is right." Daniel cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Sterling, what happens now?" Ethan looked around Maison Aurelia one final time before answering. "Now." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Now we rebuild the culture." He pointed toward the piano stage. "Starting there." Naomi looked up in confusion. Ethan turned fully toward her. "Naomi Carter," he said clearly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "Effective immediately, you no longer work as waitstaff in this building." Her eyes widened slightly. Panic flickered across her face for half a second. "Fired." Of course. The room seemed to tighten around her chest instantly. But Ethan continued before fear could fully settle. "You will become the featured resident pianist of Maison Aurelia." Complete silence crashed over the restaurant again. Naomi stared at him speechlessly. Daniel blinked in disbelief. Even the bartenders froze mid-motion behind the counter. Ethan stepped closer to the piano. Full salary. Full health benefits for you and your brother. Flexible schedule. And nobody in this building will ever ask you to shrink yourself again. Naomi's breath caught sharply in her throat. For a second, she looked like she might cry, but she fought hard to maintain composure. Because people who survive difficult lives learn how to hold emotion inside, even when their hearts are breaking open. Victoria stood abruptly, furious now. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You are handing opportunities to someone because you feel guilty. Ethan looked directly at her. No, he replied softly. I am giving an opportunity back to the person this world should have never taken it from in the first place. The restaurant fell silent once more. And somewhere beyond the tall windows of downtown Chicago, social media exploded with a single phrase spreading faster every minute. The Queen has returned. 3 months later, the line outside Maison Aurelia wrapped halfway around the block. Black SUVs crowded the curb beneath the glowing gold sign, while reporters stood beside velvet ropes, hoping to capture even a glimpse of the woman everyone in Chicago had started calling the Midnight Pianist. Inside the restaurant, everything looked different now. The lighting felt warmer. The staff smiled more naturally. Managers greeted servers by name instead of barking orders across the dining room. For the first time in years, employees ate free meals during breaks instead of leftover scraps hidden in the kitchen. Small changes. Human changes. The kind that mattered. And at the center of it all sat a grand piano beneath a single spotlight. Naomi Carter adjusted the silver bracelet around her wrist, while soft applause echoed through the packed restaurant. She no longer wore a waitress uniform. Tonight, she wore a simple black evening gown that shimmered softly beneath the chandeliers without trying too hard to impress anyone. Grace does not need permission to enter a room. Her hair fell naturally across her shoulders while guests from across the country filled every reservation inside Maison Aurelia just to hear her play. Some came because of the viral video. Others came because the story touched something they did not know they still had inside them. Hope. Ethan Sterling stood quietly near the back lounge watching the crowd settle into silence. He had refused every interview request about that night. Reporters called him a hero. Social media called him the billionaire who bought a restaurant for a waitress. But Ethan hated those headlines because they missed the point entirely. He did not save Naomi Carter. He simply stopped the room from destroying something valuable. Naomi saved herself the moment she chose not to kneel. Across the dining room, Marcus Carter rolled slowly toward the piano in his wheelchair, wearing a tailored navy suit and a grin so wide it could light the whole building. His physical therapy had improved dramatically over the past few months thanks to the medical specialists Ethan arranged through Sterling Health Partners. Naomi glanced toward her younger brother and smiled softly. Real smiles still felt unfamiliar sometimes. But she was learning. Near the front windows, Daniel Reeves greeted customers personally now, his arrogance replaced by humility after nearly losing everything that night. Ethan kept him employed under one condition. Every employee in the building would be treated with dignity or management would change permanently. Funny how quickly culture shifts once respect becomes policy instead of decoration. The lights dimmed slowly across the restaurant. Conversations faded. Glasses settled quietly onto white linen tablecloths. Naomi walked toward the piano beneath a sea of watchful eyes. But this time the attention felt different. Not judgment. Not pity. Recognition. She sat down carefully and rested her fingers above the keys. The same position. The same piano. But she was no longer the frightened waitress trying to survive humiliation beneath chandelier lights. Tonight, she looked like a woman reclaiming herself one note at a time. Ethan watched from the shadows near the bar, hands resting quietly inside his pockets. A young reporter beside him whispered softly, "Do you ever regret spending $80 million on one emotional decision?" Ethan looked toward Naomi as the first delicate piano note drifted through Maison Aurelia like falling rain. Then he answered without hesitation. No, his voice stayed calm. Certain. Because buildings are expensive. He paused briefly while Naomi's music wrapped around the restaurant in warm waves of elegance and truth. But restoring someone's dignity? Ethan glanced around the room filled with wealthy strangers, now sitting silently before the woman they once would have overlooked without a second thought. That is priceless. Naomi closed her eyes while she played, And for the first time in years, she no longer sounded like someone mourning the life she lost. She sounded like someone finally becoming the person she was always meant to be. And beneath the golden lights of Maison Aurelia, nobody saw a waitress anymore. They saw a queen.